Good morning. I'm Gary Roberts. This morning we're going to do a sphere project using 3 separate axes, using the lathe to create a perfectly round or very nearly round sphere. I have here some examples of some of the spheres that I've turned over the last few months, and some of the uses that you can put a sphere to as a practical matter. Different woods produce different spheres. Even in the same limb of a tree, you can get an entirely different look one to the other. Starting on the far end, down here we've got palm wood. Then toward me, a crepe myrtle. That's an unusual wood. Has really interesting colors. Don't pass up a piece of crepe myrtle. It's a nice wood. Texas ebony is the next subject. Then a piece of oak that was spalting, beginning to turn colors and have spots in it. And this particular one, I took a 1 3/8 drill after I'd turned the sphere, put it in the drill press and drilled a 1 3/8 hole with a Forstner bit, and you can get the clocks or even little photographs to go in a sphere. Turn a ring for the base, and you make a real nice desk set for someone. I used a different kind of base here on this piece of Texas ebony to make it a little more intricate. A base with a turned ring and then carved feet on it, and again it serves as a nice display unit. This piece of red cedar, aromatic cedar, turns out real nice. It's a little more difficult in the turning and the sanding, but you just use a heavier sandpaper and you can still do the same thing. Again, a different style base here where you have an elevated pedestal. The last one is a work in progress. This is a turn sphere that will have a base that it will drop down into where this ring will set. And in the top of it, I'll drill some holes and have some turn flowers coming out the top. The base for this one is not very fancy, but it's certainly economical. Piece of roll of tape will serve handy once you get your sphere turned to keep it from rolling off the table. Good thing that will work. The other pieces here are just odds and ends, some mesquite, another piece of white cedar. This is a piece of black walnut that was beginning to spalt on one side, so it has one side that looks like black walnut and the other side that looks like spalted black walnut. And you really get some interesting grain patterns in working with spheres. What we'll do this morning is take from the very beginning, choosing a piece of wood to turn, how you select it. We'll cut it on a bandsaw to fit into the lathe. We'll mount it in the lathe and do the full turning, and we'll start right now. After deciding that we were going to do the sphere project, I went out to the wood pile and looked for something that I could turn that would be relatively symmetrical, be relatively straight, and you can use your own imagination once you get into turning spheres to try to figure out which is the best one to turn. But a good way to find what you want is a tool that's scribed into circles, and just hold it up against the side of the log to see how symmetrical it would be. You don't necessarily have to stay in the center of the log. You can move over to one side. You can use quarter sawn. You can go into burls. just about any piece of wood you can turn into a sphere. But I found this piece of live oak that looked pretty good. A piece of mesquite. Mesquite always works well, and one of my favorite woods. This piece had some problems in that it was hard to figure an area that would be symmetrical and turn relatively well. But as an example, you could take this piece and turn a smaller sphere out of it, out of the elbow, by cutting off the ends here and here and turning a smaller sphere. Or you can cut the bend off and cut it off here and turn a sphere out of this area right here. I think this morning what we'll use is this piece of mesquite here that has a pretty good symmetry in it. We'll move a little over toward the fork of the tree to try to pick up some good grain color and cut the piece off in the bandsaw on here and here. In our turning process, we want to work on 3 axes. The first axis, after we turn the piece into the round, get rid of the bark, go down to the balanced cylinder, we'll make a mark through this at the center, what will be the center of our first axis of the sphere. After we create the first axis, we will measure the diameter of that axis and then divide that into 2 pieces, 1/2 each side, to create the ends of the sphere. Turn down with a parting tool to mark those ends, and then waste away either side to get that wood out of the way where we can begin to turn the round. Once we get the round turned and the ends cut off, we'll still have our center marked axis. We'll turn that 90 degrees with the lathe, with the waves of the lathe, and turn it between a jam chuck and a piece on our live center to push it into the jam chuck in this manner. Then we'll turn that 90-degree axis and mark it. After we mark the second 90-degree axis, where those 2 lines intersect will become our third axis, where these 2 lines intersect. Then we'll turn those between the jam chuck and the live center to be our third axis. So we have turned from 180 degrees, turned it 90 degrees, and then another 90 degrees. Now 180 plus 90 plus 90 is 360 degrees. The 360 degrees is the circle that we're looking for and the sphere that we're looking for. So for you mathematicians and folks, engineering folks that really enjoy this kind of challenge, that's how we come with the 3 axes. To get to those 3 axes, we'll need a cushion for our cup and pin live center. I've taken just a scrap of wood off of a live center that was already imprinted from a different project. It's already got the imprint of the pin and the cup in the back of it. Turned it, squared it off with a parting tool, and glued a piece of leather onto it with just regular CA glue. Different sizes of these would come in handy for different projects. For this particular procedure, it's just mandatory to be able to push that sphere into the cup that we're holding. And I've made several different sizes here. If you're turning plates or platters or saucers, even a lot of the bowl projects that you turn, if you'll use this little tool on your live center, you won't imprint whatever you're pushing against with your tailstock, and you'll find it's just a handy tool to have. I've made a larger one and just dedicated a live center to this particular project, lined it with leather, turned it with a cup for turning rather large spheres, larger than any that we've seen this morning. It needs a larger cup on the Lathe center. If you're going to turn something that's 8 to 12 inches in diameter, you really need something of this size rather than the smaller diameter of this to hold it into the cup center. Now, to make our jam chuck, I mounted one in this one in this is a supernova chuck, a waste block, turned it to the round, turned it into a cylinder, turned a cup on the front of it so that when we push this sphere into that cup center, it will hold it centered and enough friction to rotate it. The caution here would be to turn it deep enough that the sphere sets on the outer ring, and turn it slightly oval and with some chamfer to it. If you leave that edge sharp and you have a catch in it and it spins on the sphere, it'll cut a ring in it. So round these off pretty good. Make sure that the sphere does not sit down in the bottom of your cup. It must sit on the ring outside only. Here's another example where you use a faceplate to create the same thing. We haven't finished this cup here because we didn't know what size sphere we were going to be turning. So this will be used, can be used over several different spheres. We can change the shape of this, recut it, narrow it down smaller. If you have a vacuum chuck, a one-way vacuum chuck, this works very good for spheres. It has an open area in it, screwed directly on like a faceplate would mount onto your lathe, and with a cushion on there, it works really well to hold a sphere in place on the larger spheres. Smaller spheres it just won't work on. If we have smaller spheres, in one of my projects I needed to turn a number of small 3/4 inch diameter spheres. So you can use a pin chuck, a smaller waste block, and a smaller cup to turn smaller spheres. You can turn them down to, the smallest I've turned is about 1/2 inch, and anything below 1/2 inch, it's a good idea to go buy some already made balls. If we're going to saw a log in the bandsaw, one of the things that I really recommend to anyone is to make a set of V-blocks to slide through your bandsaw so that you don't have your log roll or rotate in here to create either damage to your bandsaw or worse, an accident to yourself, to your hands or your fingers. I really highly recommend that you make a set of V-blocks, put them on your bandsaw, and anytime you start toward it with a log or anything round, think about those V-blocks and use them diligently. In selecting this log, now that we're the bandsaw, we know about our V-blocks, we're going to use those, then we need to select a area on the log, and we can measure with a scale, get some idea about our rough diameter. We want a couple of inches more than that on each end, so about twice the diameter of the log is going to give you a good rule to follow in cutting out your blank. In this particular instance, I want to go up into this area so I can use a piece of chalk across the bark. It's hard to see pencil, so chalk works real good here. Then come back the other way. I've got about twice my diameter here. Now I've got rough ideas of where I want to cut around the blank through the bandsaw. I put both blocks over to the side of the blade here and cradle the log in that so that I can cut the end off, the waste here, and then I'll turn the log around and cut the other end off at the chalk mark. Adjust the blade so that it clears the wood and doesn't leave a lot of extra blade sticking out. Don't want to saw my blocks in two. That can happen too. Now we have our blank ready to go. When we cut this, we found the worms had been working on it. The powder post beetle had been working on it pretty good on this end and some on this end. But that's all right. We're just going to turn it, wormholes and all, into a sphere. And we can do several things. We can patch the holes or we can leave them just natural. In this particular instance, I think we're just going to leave them natural. We've got an example over there I'll show you a little later where we turned the sphere and just left the holes open. I've mounted a spur center in the live center, into the power head. Put a cup and pin live center in the tailstock. Because of our dust collector box here, and I have a little problem getting up close with my tailstock slide, I'll use a 6-inch extender in the tailstock. These extenders have number 2 Marsh taper, male and female, are available through Rec Supply. Most of the wood turning companies will have these extenders. They can be used in the headstock or the tailstock. In this particular instance, we need a little extra length in here, so we'll put it in the tailstock side, put our cup and pin live center in there, come to the center of the mass, and usually if you'll just start your pen and rotate it by hand and look at the high side of the blank, you can tell when you're pretty well in center. It looks pretty close. Always check the speed of your lathe. Make sure that you're not turning a rough piece of wood, an unbalanced piece of wood, on at 2,000 RPM. It's just not a good idea. You don't even want to be in the same shop with it. And there are a lot of people that have had accidents by forgetting to check their lathe speed. So check your lathe speed. With the lathe that we're using here is a Powermatic with a fully variable speed on it, so I can turn the speed well down, turn the lathe switch on, and gradually increase the speed of the lathe to get another view, or a second view, of how well I've centered this piece. And as you can see on close-up here, that's pretty close. Turn the speed up a little bit and you can see that the solid image that you see across here is going to be the solid part of the piece that we'll be turning. This end where the fork of the tree was you can see is further out around. Now that we're comfortable that we've pretty well centered the piece, we can turn the lathe off, mount our tool rest, and you don't change the tool rest position unless the lathe is off to 0 RPM. If you change the position of the tool rest and this thing is turning, you can have a pretty nasty grab between the piece and the tool rest. So we always check your tool rest, move your tool rest, position it, and rotate the wood by hand to make sure that you don't have tighten. So now we're tight here and here and here. We're pushed in here with our tailstock. Our tool rest is tight in both places. Then we're ready to begin turning. I'm comfortable with that. I'm going to use a large roughing gouge. You can use a smaller one. This one works really handy for this kind of work. We find that this one has some benefits of turning ends, squaring off ends with this outer edge here and here, much as you would a parting tool. Center of the tool will be used for taking off the bark and the mass that we don't want to waste away. I would encourage everyone to wear a face mask. I would encourage you to use a dust mask all the time. In this instance this morning, I won't be wearing a dust mask because it's hard to talk with a dust mask on and do the work that we're trying to do this morning. But a good dust mask, cover your nose and your mouth, keep that dust out of your lungs. It's cumulative and it can be a bad problem in later years. I would encourage this kind of safety equipment. I also, when I'm turning something with bark on it, like this piece here, I like to wear a glove with the fingers cut out so I can feel and pick up and do things. It has a padded center to lessen the vibration that is transferred through the tool. But if part of this bark comes off and part of it doesn't, it can give your knuckles a pretty good wrapping before you can move them away from the tool rest. So it's a good idea to wear some protection on the hand closest to the tool rest, particularly when you're turning something with bark on it. I started at about 250 to 300 RPM. As I begin to get this bark off, I can easily reach over and add another 100 or so RPM so that I increase the efficiency of the tool and the lathe. it off and see what we have here. And you can see we've got a lot of worm damage in the log here directly under the bark. We'll turn a little more of that away. Not too sure whether this was a real good choice or not, but we're going to turn a sphere out of this thing. Where I start, I want to move my tool rest up a little bit. Once you get the rough turned off of this, it's a good idea to try to maintain an even plane across the surface here so that we've got a balanced cylinder all the way down. If you've got some ends that are not cut relatively square, they can throw you out of balance too. So one of the things we want to do is I can turn the tool well over on its side and using just the corner of this, I can square that in very comfortably. You don't want to get down into your spur center, but turn it over and then use the other corner on the other end. So without having to stop for a parting tool, I can square both ends with this one large roughing gouge. And now I've got more of a balanced cylinder, and I can maintain that plane as I get on down closer to what I want to achieve in the diameter of the sphere. Now let's turn it off and take a look at it now and see what it looks like. Okay, we've still got some wormholes here. Most of them gone on this side, most gone on that side. So I think we're probably close enough to take a little more of this off right here where it had the bark inclusion. We'll take a little more off of that, maybe another 1/8 of an inch, and then we'll mark our first axis and decide that that's what's going to be the axis for our first axis for our sphere. Now that we've made our first decision on this is what's going to be our sphere, we'll select an area in here along the sphere to be the center, the first center of the sphere. And here we got some pretty good damage there and there. We're not sure what these will be. I think we'll just probably we'll turn the speed of the lathe way down so that we get just a nice slow turn here to make our first axis. Now we've created our first axis. Get our calipers out here. Turn the lathe off and get our first dimension. And this is 4 7/8. Now 4 7/8 divided by 2 to go equal distance from our center line that our first axis gives us is a little difficult for me to figure. So I use the other side of the rule. I'll go over on the metric side, and it just makes it a lot easier for me to read 8.6 centimeters. So 4.3 either side of our center line is going to be our dimension we want to create the other two ends. Again, we'll turn the lathe back on, go to 4.3, and 4.3, or we could go to 8.6 from the center, but it's just a lot easier for me to go in halves. Now we can come back. Six. We're right on with our calipers. The reason we're doing this, the diameter here must be equaled by, that's our A dimension, this is our B dimension. The B dimension has to be equal for the sphere to be round. So this is going to be our center line and stay in place. We'll take a parting tool and go in either side to determine where the ends of our sphere will be. We'll cut straight in with our parting tool. Okay. Take our parting tool, we'll go in on each end. When using a parting tool, it's a good idea to make your parting tool cut 2 parting tool widths wide, or a parting tool and a half. Don't try to go right straight in for any depth, or your parting tool will begin to bind up with chips and you'll get torqued down, and eventually you'll either bind up the cut or jerk the parting tool out of your hand. Parting tool and a half wide, and we'll go straight in trying to maintain. We want to maintain as near 90 degrees to this as we can as we go in. If we go slightly out or slightly in, we've changed the shape of our sphere. So we'll go in as far as we can, leave about a inch or inch and a half diameter tenon on each end. And use our roughing gouge again to waste away these 2 ends. Again, I'm using the outer edge of this roughing gouge to get up in right near the workpiece without getting a cut. Come back with our parting tool. Now we can take it on down to about a 3/4 tenon on each end. And that will provide enough stability to do the turning of our sphere. Go ahead. As we start turning, one of the things that you can do to maintain some perspective on what your sphere is going to be is, again, this tool that we had used earlier to determine the center of the mass of the log. We can look through this to see how much we want to take off of the corners and roughly what the size of our sphere will be when we get through. So it's a good tool to use at this point too. We can use the roughing gouge just a little more to take off these rounded corners, and then we'll switch to a deep fluted gouge for the rest of the work on the sphere. Remember, as we look through the pattern to see what the sphere is going to look like, these corners were round. So don't try to take the corners off flat. We want them rounded to begin with. If we maintain those radiuses as we continue on, it'll be a lot easier to wind up with a round sphere without bad flat spots on it that reduce the size of the sphere. See what's happening here now? The center line, the first axis, helps us keep some perspective on how we're progressing. We're getting so close in here now with the larger tool, going to have to go to the deep fluted gouge. Let me switch to the gouge. Now that we've got the corners beginning to come off here, you can see some of the worm damage that we've got, some small stuff over here. But you can also see that we're beginning to pick up some changes in the grain on the areas here. We need to take a little more off of this area so we don't catch when we get down in that groove. But now that we switched to a deep fluted gouge, we'll begin turning these corners off with the front radius of the tool to get down into these areas. And then we'll roll it over and do a shear scrape so that we go down grain, and we're able with these long radiuses to maintain our oval position in the piece that we're working on. Shorter radiuses for moving more material, longer radiuses for maintaining our position. Need to get rid of some of this in here where we get in there with our tool. And by holding the handle down further and rolling this tool way over on its side, I can get a nice shear scrape. You can see the real fine shavings that's coming off of that with the shear scrape. Good sharp tool, low handle, high approach up here off of the tool rest. Get a nice little shear scrape, and we'll be, as you can see, we're working down grain from the outside toward the inside of the piece, trying to maintain that oval shape for our sphere. Like I may have got a little deep right there. Come back and see if we can take that out of it. Remember that any undercut on this sphere means that the whole sphere has to come down in diameter. Now we can check by using our calipers from our center line. We had 43 or 4.3 centimeters. See if we're still in perspective. Left side looks good. Right side is a little bit long. We can come in again and remark. Just left side's all right, right side maybe a little bit further out. And come back with our parting tool, reestablish our end here, where that end that looked like we were a little bit undercut now seems to be a little better. Just a few more passes here. And we have our first axis rough cut. We've got it marked. Now we'll take it out of the lathe, go to the bandsaw and nip off these two ends and put our cup chuck on here and begin to turn the second axis. So if you will, follow me over to the bandsaw and we'll set up with our blocks. Okay. Instead of using the two blocks on this particular one, the diameter of this is such that I can put one end of this in a V block and the other end on the bed of the saw and make my cut. Now we have the beginning of the sphere. And you remember the little leather piece that we made for the live center end of that? See where this live center is imprinted into that? We can use this again in the future if we want to, put it back between centers and turn it into a cushion for another sphere turning project. On this particular project, I've decided we'll use the little supernova chuck and a waste block that we've already prepared with a cup center in it. And I had used this on a previous project. So what I will do is come in with my deep fluted gouge. It's a little bit out of round from the previous project, so I'll re-true it. Now you can see here we've got a nice little radius on the cup. I put a little double stick tape on the back side of this cushion, put it on the cup and pin center, and the double stick tape keeps it from falling off when we start changing our positions on it regularly later during our sanding process, because if you don't have that on there, every time you stop, this will fall off. So a little double stick tape helps it stay on our live center. And we took this was our first axis. And what we'll do is rotate this 90 degrees, check to see that it fits down into the cup but doesn't hit bottom, turn it directly with the lathe, ways of the lathe, and tighten it down. Rotate it, make sure that it looks like it's in the center. Check our lathe speeds. We're at about 1,000 RPM. Got an interesting little spot there we may want to patch later. Patch it with super glue, CA super glue. Set our tool rest. Now, you can see just the solid image and then the shadow image, this image that's just barely visible outside the solid image there. And now the part that we want to turn off is only that shadow image. If we turn down into the solid portion of that image, then we've reduced the overall size of the sphere. It's okay, it's just that it takes more turning when you do that. We'll now take the wide radius part of our deep fluted gouge, and remember that the grain direction now is running at 90 degrees to the lathe, rather than with it. So we'll start out on the outer edge and come toward the center with a nice little shear scrape, a light cut from both directions. Excuse me there. Well, we got it awful close now. What we can't turn is what is under the live center here and under the cup. Now that we have our second axis turn, we can reduce the speed of the project. And establish our second axis. And there's no real reason to measure this. You just go to the high point of that. And with the lathe off, we can bring these lines together. Doesn't have to be precision, it just needs to be where we can tell where these two lines intersect, because we have turned 180 degrees, then we've turned 90 degrees. Now we'll get our third axis turning. And the third axis will be where these two lines intersect, here and here. We'll go directly under the cup and directly under the live center. And you can see this raised area here that was under the cup here earlier. See that area right there where we couldn't get to it. Now we'll be able to take that off. And let's see, we stop here just a minute, and I want to. You can see we still have this little bark inclusion here, the worm damage in this area. Here's where our tenon was earlier. There was our second axis mark that we made. You can see the little raised area right here that was under the cup chuck. All we have to do now is turn off this portion that is the shadow image, and we'll have our sphere roughed in. And then we turn the axis to where it's with the lathe again. We will make light cuts. Maybe a little more lathe speed. You See that shadow image disappearing as we're working on it. Take a look at it. It looks like we may have a little ridge right here next to this cup. We're going to step back 1/2 step here and bring that image off. Go back to our other up. Now see that we had a slight catch in there, and you can see that it's pulled this sphere over in this cup to where now we're well out around. So we need to turn the lathe off, reposition. See how loose that was? Didn't get it quite tight enough. Now we're back to where we ought to be. We'll take off. Take a look at the pretty rough, isn't it? We've got our sphere in pretty good shape everywhere but at this one little flat area right here that was under our cup. And to get that out, we're going to turn it back to its original axis. Take some small cuts on that, and then we'll sand. So you can see how near our sphere is there with the very little shadow image that we have. And we'll take some really light cuts in there. And we're going to turn it off and sand it. We want to take our tool rest out. Got our chisel. We don't want to sand over the tool rest. Because if you catch your fingers between the tool rest and that turning wood, it's not going to be a good day. So now, even though I don't like to sand without a mask, we'll use we've got a pretty rough piece of wood, we'll use a rough piece of sandpaper. Let me get now. When we're sanding this, we want to remember that our 3-axis for sanding is just as critical for sanding as it is for turning. When you get to this point, there's no need in really establishing pencil lines on here. By now you will have become relatively acquainted with the grain patterns. So you can actually use the grain patterns rather than pencil marks. If you're uncomfortable with that and it's a real plain piece of wood, then use pencil marks on your first couple of sanding grits. And then forego the pencil marks later, because by then you will be familiar with it. Because I'm not using a mask this morning, I'm going to turn on the dust collector system now, and we'll use the dust collector system that is connected to this box here behind the head of the lathe, and to a piece of PVC pipe that goes back to the dust collector. So we'll turn that on to get rid of the dust where we don't have to breathe that. You can see how the dust goes directly into the box. Because this piece was pretty rough to begin with, I'm starting with 120 grit paper. In keeping up with your sandpaper, I found that it works really good to take some file folders, make a little box or get a accordion folder system, mark the file folders with the grits. Like we've done 120, we'll go with 150 next. But it keeps your paper straight and dry and sorted. If you mix several different grits of sandpaper in a drawer together, you're certainly going to mix the grit that are on the sandpaper together. So that when you get down to 220, you may have some 100 grit grains on that piece of 220 paper. And you hold it up to your nice finished piece of work and you wonder where those mysterious little scratches come from. And this is just a good way to keep up with your sandpaper. We found that it just works very well. We'll start with 150, go with 150 next on our project, and use the collector on. So we're going to go turn the dust collector back on again to get rid of that dust. Down through 220. For this demonstration, I think it'd be just fine to stop at the 220 level. Our piece looks pretty good. We're now ready to put some finish on it and polish it. Now that we have our sphere turned, we're going to apply a finish and do a little buffing on it. I found one finish that I like to, for nearly 90% of what I do, I use Deft, Clear. This is spray can. This is the liquid. And I use about this much Deft in there, then put some more lacquer thinner in behind it. I saw a brush off that I can put into the bottle, put the lid back on it so I don't have to clean the brush regularly. I clean the brush about once a year whether it needs it or not. But I use what I call the wet and wipe method. I take the brush, get it over a cloth, and just wet the piece down all over. Try to soak it in as much as it will take. And then wipe it off. I usually take my glove off, so I'll do that anyway.
Exactly.
Now that I've got my glove off, I can handle this a little better. I'll do the same thing again. Usually 2 or 3 coats. Doesn't take but just moments to put another coat on and wipe off the excess. Now the piece is beginning to look like it's soaked up all of the Deft that it will absorb. Well, one more time, just for good measure. I like not having to clean the brush. We'll rub this off and then let it set for a few moments while we set up for our buffing system. I have a Jacob's chuck set up with a number 2 Morse taper on it, so it can be used tailstock or headstock. And I put this in the headstock and use it as a lathe as a power source. Give it a little tap with a mallet so that it's good and seated. Use it as a power source to run my bell buffing system. Bell buffing system consists of 3 different phases for buffing. First is triple E. It's the coarser of the compounds. Triple E compound comes in a bar. Turn your lathe down, put a little, doesn't take but just a little on the wheel. Once it becomes impregnated with the compound, it stays really well. I do keep the different buffing pads. This is the triple E, this is white diamond, and this is wax. And I keep them in their own separate plastic bags so that you don't transfer triple E compound to the wax buffing pad or vice versa. So I keep them separate, just like I keep my sandpaper in separate folders, because these different grits can transfer from one buffing pad to another, and then it diminishes the quality of your buffed and finished piece. So now that we've got our triple E charged up here, I usually run this, depends on the project certainly, but I usually run it at about 800 to 1000 RPM. 800 to 1000 RPM and an 8-inch wheel, the outside of that 8-inch wheel is moving along at a pretty good clip. You take a good grip with both hands and start working your way over the finished piece. And if you get in fairly close, you can see that this piece is already beginning to take a shine, and it also takes on a different feel. You can actually feel where the buffing pad has been and where the grain was raised with the sealant that we used, the deft sealant that we used. As soon as you've gone over it pretty thoroughly, and I like to start with the end grain, polish the end grain, turn it over, polish the end grain, and then go back and polish the side grain.
Okay.
Now that we've finished with the triple E, we'll go to the white diamond. Put this back in its bag. Do the white diamond, and we do the same thing. This works really quickly. I just hand tighten the chuck on the threads of the spindle. Charge it with a little bit of white diamond. Don't overcharge your wheels or you'll have a buildup on your piece. So a light charging there. Again, I'll just buff the end grain. Then hold the end grain between my fingers and thumb on my right hand. That way I can go around the piece. And when I get back to where I started, I've already covered the entire piece. That makes a good starting point. Sure not hard to remember. Now we go to the white diamond. I mean, this was white diamond. We'll go to the wax. Tool rest makes a pretty good place to hold the sphere. Charge it up. This is carnauba wax. Our final effort in the project. And we'll buff the end grains. And there we have our sphere. Turned on 3-axis, polished, sanded and polished. I've had a ball. Enjoy turning.